remarks, it is now my pleasure to invite our key speaker for this morning. And he is Jason Farley. Jason is an experienced aviation professional for over 28 years. He has worked in both private and public sectors in Guyana and Antigua. Jason is currently employed with the Guyana Defense Force and serves as chairman of the board of directors at Guyana National Shipping Corporation Limited. He is also a member of CCGI and is very passionate about improving corporate governance in his home country of Guyana and the wider Caribbean. I proudly welcome you, Jason, and I invite you to share your thoughts as you deliver today's opening segment as we move our focus on governance of the public sector, the state sector. Thank you, and over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Kamala, for your warm welcome. I'm very pleased to be part of Governance Week 2024. I believe I would have participated last year. We had some exciting moments last year, I remembered. And I'm also very pleased and happy, as you mentioned earlier, to be part of this movement that is transforming not only individual members, but communities and regional states. So today I'll be talking on governance in the public sector in the Guyanese context. And I have a presentation prepared, which I would like to share. So today, this presentation will focus on public sector governance, or how the state sector organizes itself to govern a country, with emphasis on Guyana. The presentation will also identify current practices that guide the government management, oversight, and public reportage of this sector, while highlighting some of the associated impact. And given that public sector governance is supported by principles and structure to ensure effective, ethical, and transparent functioning of public institutions, the presentation hopes to bring reason that modernization through the provision of government services will require periodical reforms to improve efficiency, systems of good governance, and accountability. I wish to point out that market demands, cultural shifts, and political uncertainties, such as geopolitical tensions, national elections, etc., oftentimes influence governments around the world to embrace private sector governance principles. Notwithstanding the aforementioned, the overall improvement in public sector performance is usually encouraged when these reforms are effectuated at the central and local government level. Just to give you a little background, the conceptualization of governance resulted out of the need for greater demand for transparency and a common will to take hold of corruption, not just in the public environment, but also in the business environment. And there's a notable impact between the stewardship and the rule of law assumption as it relates to the reduction of transgression. Indeed, the significance of governance has become apparent owing to economic conditions encountered in both developed and developing countries. And we know too well of the many scandals many countries would have experienced over the years. And so the efforts by government to improve corporate performance and sustainability through the adoption of governance principles and regulatory compliance continues to gain support because of the positive impact on national and global economies. In many countries, such as Guyana, that gained independence from British rule during the 1960s and 70s, many governments were forced to immediately reorganize and reform administrative departments that were previously governed under a traditional colonial system. Under this colonial system, the functions of government and many public institutions were structured to provide limited services, such as the judiciary, police, mail, and broadcast, with the express aim of preserving law and order within the colony. The increased involvement of Caribbean governments in the sectors of the economy in their respective countries cannot go unnoticed. And in most cases, those reasons are quite justifiable. For instance, in Guyana's case, early post-independence, the government was quite aggressive in their reform program. Areas of focus included public governance, transparency, international treaty obligations, local government, and the rule of law. And these reforms were made through the restructuring of state institutions to dispense suitable means of governance and encourage participation by all sections of society. Also, in the early years, many public enterprises as state-owned were nationalized. Nationalization, as we know, is the process of transforming privately owned assets into public assets by bringing them under the public ownership of the national government. Moreover, Guyana being a developing country, the demands placed upon the government to have a modern infrastructure, facilities, financial reserves and investment, and a competent labor force, among other requirements, dictated an appropriate response of the state to be entwined with all aspects of the economy. Initially, in Guyana's case, macroeconomic reforms were mobilized around commerce, mining, and the agricultural sectors. Presently, governance in the public sector has taken on somewhat a hybrid approach. On one hand, you have the government embracing corporate governance principles as practiced by private entities. And on the other hand, the government has embraced legislation that was primarily influenced by countries such as the United States, Canada, and United Kingdom, owing to their intervention to address frequent internal political problems. Now, these problems were rooted and caused by groups or different sections of society for greater political representation at the level of parliament, state boards, on-state boards, and other statutory bodies. Additionally, because the government having to borrow monies from international lending agencies such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund to fund institutional reform programs in sectors such as public health and the financial sectors, these lending agencies usually stipulate mandatory governance reforms as a prerequisite to obtaining the loans, with a view of that proper reforms will bring about much needed socio-economic improvements to citizens. So what is public sector governance? The World Bank defines governance as an approach in which power is employed to manage a country's economic and social resources for development. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development further pointed out that governance is really an interconnection relationship between institutions, employees, and other key stakeholders. Now in Guyana, the public sector includes the central and local government, non-revenue earning businesses, and public revenue earning businesses, agencies, and statutory bodies. I wish to point out that Guyana is governed by 3 separate but complementary branches of government that comprise the public sector, there being the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judiciary. Now, this slide speaks about public institutions and organizations. And when we look at how the public sector is organized, you first have the core government that comprises of the governing body, headed by an executive president, as mentioned before. You have various branches, departments, ministries, and they work together to support the government. You also have statutory bodies and agencies, and they're clearly part of the government to deliver public programs, goods, or services, but they may exist as separate organizations in their own right. A good example is the Guyana Revenue Authority, and their primary function is to collect tax, VAT collection, revenue collection. Then you have the Guyana Gold Board. This is a statutory body that was established in 1982 under an act of Parliament. And so all gold produced in Guyana by law must be sold to the Guyana Gold Board. So they're involved in gold trading business, both locally and internationally. Now, I wish to point out that these agencies, these statutory bodies, they're usually given oversight usually by a ministry. And then you have public enterprises. And these are agencies that deliver public programs, goods, or services, but operate independently of government. They compete in private markets and make profits. A good example is the Guyana Oil Company. This is a government-owned petroleum distribution company. You have also the Guyana National Shipping Corporation, an entity of which I'm chairperson. And you have the Chedijagan International Airport. These entities all being public enterprises that delivers public programs, goods, or services, and they operate independently of the government. You also have state businesses, and these are government-owned and controlled businesses that sells goods or services for profit in the marketplace. And I know one of the key concerns over the years, even as it relates to good corporate governance principles, you really don't want the state to be involved in direct competition with private entities. But in many instances, such a scenario does exist. And so a good example as it relates to a state business, you have the government owns and operates a Marriott hotel. And certainly that hotel is in direct competition with privately owned hotels within the hospitality industry. You also have the Guyana Defense Force, and this is somewhat a hybrid situation where you have the military, the local military being involved in business. And so what the military does is provide aviation support services to hinterland communities. And again, this is in direct competition to local aviation operators. And finally, you have public contractors. These are legally independent entities outside government. They're not necessarily part of the government public structure, but it was important to mention this arm because they receive public funding. And the public funding that they receive is usually to aid in support of delivering goods and services to the general public. So this slide gives you an overview of the many public institutions, key public institutions that exist. You have the president, who's also the head of state, heading the executive branch. We talked earlier about the judiciary and the legislative branch. And out of the executive branch, you have the cabinet, which comprise the president and his ministers. You have the individual ministers heading the various ministries. You have the permanent secretaries, and then you have the local government arm consisting of the regional chairman, the regional executive officer, the mayors, the NDC chairmen, etc. So let's briefly talk about governance in action. There are parallels between the private and the public sector governance. For instance, private sector governance is corporate governance in action in listed firms, while public sector governance is essentially corporate governance applied within the duties of public sector stakeholders, administrators, and agents to manage public funds. Some conditions in which private sector operates creates considerable challenges for firms. The repercussions of non-performance, termination of employees' contracts, hostile takeovers, and regulatory fines provide sufficient motivation for private sector companies to consistently spare no effort towards upgrade and reforms of their governance practices. For these reasons, among others, most private sector companies tend to outperform their private sector counterparts or agencies performing similar role or functions. There is, however, a rival view that implies that public sector governance experience is much more vast and complex from a historical standpoint, to the extent that a number of governance framework and approaches adopted in the private sector are unfitting for the public sector. In Guyana, companies are governed by the Companies Act, Chapter 8901, and incorporated into the laws of Guyana. The Act covers both public and private companies, sole traders, and partnerships. Public sector entities having governance involvement comprise of many and various statutory bodies, state-owned corporations, advisory committees, school boards, agencies, public-private partnership bodies, and partially owned companies. So although the Act covers public sector entities, one can easily argue that owing to the way in which these entities operate, coupled with their respective form, the application of the provisions of the Act will be more complicated. When we speak of the way in which these entities operate, we are referring to entities having to be subjected to national legislation and political direction. Since all public institutions and bodies come under a government ministry and therefore reports to a subject minister. Also, administrators, managers, and board directors of these institutions and bodies may be summoned when necessary according to law to be answerable to parliamentary committees or the public. Now, owing to some challenges in managing different agencies through their respective ministries, the government set up a company to do so, and that company is referred to as National Industrial and Commercial Investments Limited. And this company is 100% owned by the government of Guyana and was incorporated in the private limited company, as a private limited company, under the Companies Act, Chapter 8901. Now, the objectives of this company, NISIL, were to acquire, hold, and manage the government shares, stocks, debentures, or other securities of any government company, cooperative societies, or other corporate bodies, and to also act as an agent for other government agencies in the disposal of properties or management of companies. To this end, the overall aim is to have a consolidated approach in the management of the government's shareholding. Incidentally, Guyana National Shipping Corporation is owned by NISIL. And I did mention that NISIL is 100% government owned. So Guyana National Shipping Corporation is one of many companies or entities that comes under NISIL. Now, let's briefly look at governance approaches between the public and private sector, because it is important to have an appreciation of how both sectors are essentially governed. When you look at the organization structure, for instance, with the private sector, you have various models, and then you have family-owned structures and so forth. The public sector, they're usually state-owned. You have a number of school boards, statutory bodies, public-private partnership, etc. As it relates to regulation, the private sector companies are governed by the Companies Act. The public sector, you have a number of entities also being governed by the Companies Act, such as GNSC. You also have statutory regulations, such as the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. I will briefly talk about that later on. And you also have the Civil Aviation Regulations, the Competition and Fair Trading Act. You also have the Customs Act, etc. With the private sector, those enterprises are agents in terms of the governance approach are for shareholders, while for the public sector, the governance structure caters to the public. In the private sector, the objectives are for profit, while in the public sector, it's usually for the public good. Now, when we talk in terms of the organ of governance model, presently in the private sector, while there is a corporate governance code, that code has not been adopted, despite previous efforts to do so. The public sector essentially does not have a corporate governance code, but we do subscribe to a number of corporate governance principles. In terms of authority, private sector enterprise, the governance structure is set up in a way that the board has the authority, while in the public sector, the authority, well, there are several authorities as it relates to the public sector. You have cabinet, you have various government ministries, and you have NISIL. And then the slide also talks about the legal responsibility, independence, and accountability. Of importance to note, in private sector enterprise, annual reports are usually done, and those are given to shareholders. This is something that is mandated by law. In the public sector, you also have annual reports or year-end reports. These reports, once approved, are laid in Parliament, being a public document. And you also have those reports also being laid by the Auditor General, who also is responsible for ensuring those documents are also laid in Parliament. Public sector governance framework. In the public sector, governance structures and practices takes different forms to ensure compliance with auditor and judicial requirements. As mentioned before, the changing nature of society, the constant reevaluation of government's responsibilities, demand for transparency and accountability have forced the development of public governance. And these are some of the principles that are adopted by the public sector. You have rule of law, transparency and openness, accountability, public sector ethics and personal governance, stewardship, and leadership. Let us briefly talk about reforms. And in areas of governance reform, successive governments in Guyana took several measures to bring about improvements. And these measures include underscoring public governance in the National Development Strategy document, which listed governance as among 30 of its priorities. And this National Development Strategy document was one that was proposed by former American President Jimmy Carter following tense political upheaval, particularly during the 90s and the 2000s. One of the most important approaches taken by the government was to reform the entire public sector to reduce wastage of resources, recruitment, and retention of competent public sector workers, improvements in efficiency, among other things. A number of ministries and public institutions were also restructured to facilitate government's ability to consult with stakeholders such as citizens, private sector organizations, unions, and opposition entities through media platform and outreaches, among other approaches, thereby increasing trust between government and the public at all levels. Now, the public sector, we talk about reforms that were necessary to ensure adherence to proper governance framework. And so one of the things I recall we had to do here at GNSC was to restructure the entire organization in a way that improved functional authority, because it was felt that GNSC, just similar to many other agencies, were too reliant on politicians to make line decisions. We also sought to establish an HR department, replacing the personnel department, for instance, because we felt that personnel departments were a thing of the past and they were unable to provide the necessary support to staff. We also sought to improve our training requirements, and this was done across many public agencies as part of the retention program for public servants. And the training includes both internal training and external training. Among other reforms taken by the government over the years, being a member of the Caribbean community, Guyana signed on to the Charter of Civil Society for the Caribbean Community, and this is a document that outlines civil participation and empowerment for the entire Caribbean region. And it aims to strengthen confidence in governance by creating a truly participatory political environment to promote genuine consultation in the process of governance.
Do you have a lot more, Jason? Because I do want the audience to engage in some Q&A with you, and we are just 10 minutes away from end time.
Okay, what I'll do, just briefly talk about transparency and accountability, and I perhaps can pause there. If that's okay, Kamala?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So one of the reform improvements that were made was to have an important component of good governance, that is transparency and accountability. And so you had the Ministry of Finance being responsible for national accountability. As it relates to accountability, among other duties, this ministry has the responsibility of preparing consolidated financial statements for the government subsequent to an audit by the Auditor General and presentation to the National Assembly. Also, in an effort to improve transparency and accountability, the government established the Access to Information Act, and this caters for the appointment of a Commissioner of Information. So if the public wants to have information that they felt should be available publicly, then that information can be sought through a Commissioner of Information. And also, the government crafted a legal framework to manage fiscal responsibility in the public sector. And this was in the form of the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act of 2003. And it provides for the regulation of the preparation and execution of annual budget and public money. And it deals with such other matters connected with or incidental to the transparent and efficient management of finances in Guyana. Kamala, I will pause there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jason. We appreciate so much the time that you would have taken to prepare all this information first. So if you want to stop the slide share now, so that way we can engage with you a lot closer in the room. And as you do that, I want to say, you know, it's really fascinating, the background you have given us for Guyana. And of course, for all of us in the Caribbean, we are looking to Guyana to see all the many changes that are coming because of the new wealth in the country. But what I thought was particularly instructive was you shared that in as much as the state recognizes that it may not want to engage in direct competition with the private sector, you were able to share examples of where they do engage in offering services to the public. And it's, if I heard you correctly, you said that some of these organizations tend to outperform their private sector counterparts. So I wanted to ask you specifically about that, because that is not common in my experience for public sector. So I wanted to ask you about that specifically. If you could share with us, you spoke about the aviation services that is offered by the military to the hinterland. Yeah. So what accounts for why they perform better than the competition in the private sector, in your opinion?
No, actually, I did mention that the private sector entities actually outperform government entities, and it has a lot to do with clearly with the adoption of the corporate principles and the necessary pressures that private entities face, unlike government entities. And so, for instance, in a private entity, you have a board whose performance is strictly, they're basically held to account and the demand to ensure the profits are being made and so forth. You really don't have that with public sector entities. Okay. You know, you don't have that with public sector entities. As it relates to the military, I think the issue with them providing a public service for reward is rooted in the desire of the government to recruit and maintain competent professionals, because some of the monies that are garnered from that service is used to pay allowances to the pilots, the mechanics, and the other professionals supporting that service.
Okay.
So that is one of the things being done to help in the retention of those skilled professionals.
Great, thanks. I see Saron has her hand up. Saron, let me invite you to ask your question or make a comment if needs be.
Thank you so much, Mr. Farley. Really enjoyed your presentation, and I'm very interested in public sector governance in different islands. And I think there's a lot we can learn from each other. But in particular, you mentioned about public sector reforms, right? And from time to time, the government would try to institute periodic reforms. Now, in Trinidad, in the public sector, we have tried sometimes as well to institute reforms, but generally, I think we struggle in that area. Because sometimes you're trying to institute a reform, which is good, right? You're trying to do something positive, but somehow the way that is done doesn't fit in with the culture. So what I'm trying to get maybe from the Guyanese perspective, have you all by and large been successful in instituting public sector reforms, and what are some of the things that you would have done, these strategies to facilitate that?
Thanks, Saron. So we just have 5 minutes to wrap up. Jason, I'm giving you that 5 minutes to answer Saron's question, right? Thanks, Saron.
Thank you, Saron, for that question. So when you look at it from a historical standpoint, one of the biggest challenges that Guyana's always have is the political disruptions around elections. And so you may have a change of government. That government will bring in or attract rather persons who are skilled, but who are not necessarily organic to a particular ministry or a particular agency or a particular enterprise. One of the things I believe the government has been forced to, in terms of the reforms, and I did mention earlier in the presentation, is that when you have certain programs that benefits the public sector, you would normally have these lending agencies saying, well, you need to have reform in this area or that area as a prerequisite to obtaining the loan. And so it is under that, for want of a better word, pressure. Some reforms are inevitable, you know, and so, and then we've also signed on to a number of conventions and treaties that mandates necessary reforms. And I think we've been faced with no other choice but to ensure that those reforms work.